What have Baptists contributed to the sciences?
How has science featured in Baptist missionary activity?
And how might Baptist theology shape how Baptists engage with science today?
My name's Tim Middleton, and I teach theology at Regent's Park College in Oxford.
And my name is Andy Goodliff. I'm a lecturer in Baptist history at Regent's Park College as well.
In this series of short podcasts, we want to explore how Baptists past and present have engaged with the discoveries and practices of modern science. Is there something unique in the way that Baptists have tended to think about science? Are there good examples of Baptists who've been involved in the sciences? And is there any such thing as a specifically Baptist perspective on science and religion?
Today we're joined by John Weaver, a geologist and former principal of South Wales Baptist College. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So John, I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about your own journey, because I know you started out as a scientist, then you became a Baptist minister, and then latterly principal of a Baptist college. So I'm wondering if you can say a bit about how you've negotiated science and religion in your own life.
Well, I grew up in a scientific home. My father was head of biology in a large grammar school in South Wales, taught evolution. When I was a child, he used to take me for long walks. He used to point out trees and plants and animals and give me their precise scientific names, which I'd largely forgotten. He brought a microscope home, and so we looked at things through the microscope. We had tadpoles, we had frog-spawn tadpoles in the back pond and watched those grow. So I suppose the observing, questioning scientist was sort of being ground into me as a child. But in 1961 was the big revolution, because a guy from the museum in Cardiff came and gave us a lecture on geology. And it was sort of pretty simple. It covered fossils and rocks and minerals. And then he said at the end of the lecture, he said, I've got these potato stones, and they look like sort of potatoes. And he held them up and he said, they come from the Triassic rocks down at Penarth, and these are about 220 million years old, and I'm going to smash one. And he said, and if you come up, you'll be the first person to see this. They're full of crystals. So I was not bashful. I sort of rushed forward to have a look. He broke it, and he said, you are the first person to see this since it formed. And I was hooked. And that was geology from then on.
So you were fascinated by science and geology in particular. At the same time, were you being fascinated by Christianity or faith, or did that come later?
No, I was growing up in a Christian home. God was always part of the equation. Went to church twice and then 3 times on a Sunday. But it was probably around the same time, actually, as this geology insight, that I actually felt that it was right that I should take that step, that my parents' faith, which I had enjoyed, became my own.
And were these two separate paths, or were they already intertwined, Christianity affecting your understanding of science and perhaps the other way around?
They certainly became intertwined in my teenage years, because I think one of the things about, first of all, biology and then geology is you're actually seeing creation. You're seeing, it's huge, it's vast, there's so much to see. And belief in the God of creation actually becomes easier, not more difficult, when you're seeing such things.
Yeah. And so you go to study science, you become a lecturer in science, and then you receive a call to Baptist ministry. Does science get left behind, or do you take your science into your formation as a Baptist minister and then into your ministry afterwards? How does that relationship continue once you became?
Well, certainly, once I'd felt called to ministry and I'd come to Regent's Park College to train, to read theology alongside fairly brief preparation for ministry. But I was already interested in looking at what the Bible had to say, because if you're studying geology, a literal understanding of the first 12 chapters of the Bible becomes impossible. And so that led me to say, well, what actually is the Bible actually talking about? And I picked up some general commentaries and had a look at what commentators were saying. And at that point, I began to sort of develop the whole idea of critical scholarship and understanding how you read and interpret Scripture. So yes, that was already happening because of science and faith coming together. Through ministry, when I was in Rushden as a minister, I used to take, we had a cub group adhered themselves to the church, and I took them out to some of the local quarries and showed them the Jurassic oolite and showed them lots of little bivalves, mostly rinconellids they're called, but they're little shells, and we found those, and the cubs were thrilled at seeing these, and I explained how they formed and where they formed, and
so this fascination with science, fascination with the Christian faith, ends up being called to ministry, and it seems these questions have been alive for you ever since, and not at least in your own thinking, but in your writing and in your research. So Tim, I wonder where this might take us next.
Sure. Well, I think sometimes it can be tempting to think that Baptists actually have a slightly uneasy relationship with science. Now, I know that's possibly not true of your own journey, but I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about why people might have that impression and whether that impression is even true.
I mean, I think that impression is right in certain quarters. I think, it's a bit like they always used to say about geologists. If you ask 25 geologists the time of day, 24 would give you a different hour, and the 25th would decide they were on the international date line. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the same with theology, certainly with Baptists and science. There are positions that are helpful and there are positions that are unhelpful. There are two unhelpful positions. One is a fundamentalist, literalist approach to the Bible, where the Bible has to be true. And so where science contradicts what the Bible says, then it's science that must be wrong and not the Bible. The alternative view, of course, is those who say, well, science must be right. And so if science is saying things that my understanding of the faith doesn't agree with, then I need to bend what the Bible says. And that's not helpful either, those sort of positions. And they also, of course, reflect the Christian versus the atheistic position. So you've got fundamentalism on one side and you've got scientism on the other side. And I think they're safe positions, actually. If that's how you see things, that's safe. You're not going to. But I believe the important place is in the middle, in the grey area, where you actually have to let these dialogue. You have to sort of, and I've found that science and faith are complementary. I've spent all my time, both as a geologist and as a minister and as a lecturer and tutor, that actually taking the questions that science raises and saying, what does that mean for faith? What are the theological ways of reflecting on these things? Be it plate tectonics, or be it human sexuality, or be it sort of where we are in terms of the origin of the universe and the origin of life. I mean, these are huge questions. And actually, when you really think about it, I think theology has a much firmer answer to the questions that are raised than anything else.
So I like the sort of spectrum that you were talking about a moment ago, where you have a kind of biblical fundamentalism at one end and a sort of scientific fundamentalism at the other. And you talked about the kind of grey area in between. Presumably there's a lot of different positions one can still take within that grey area, right? There's not just one version that says, they're compatible, it's all fine. There's a few different positions one might hold in that area. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would, because I think if you say it's compatible and that's fine, that means you're not thinking.
Right.
Okay. I'm talking about complementarity, when actually you take the question seriously and don't sort of duck the issues. And so in both my courses on practical theology and my courses on science and faith, both in Oxford and in more particularly at Cardiff University. I have dealt with those questions head on. And it's interesting, the response that I had from students were, I'm glad you've addressed that question. Or when I was in the States doing the same thing, my pastor said if I even thought about that question, I was going to hell. And I said, well, that's... And they said, it's so good to have somebody who is doing this thinking and asking Christian questions, God questions, about the science.
So that question of role models is interesting as well, because I wonder if one of the other difficulties perhaps is that Baptists perhaps aren't aware of other figures from Baptist life who've been interested in the sciences. Are there people we're missing? Are there people out there who have been engaged in Baptist life and scientific activity that could be these sort of role models for people, do you think?
Other than yourself, John?
Thank you. I think you're right there, and I've been privileged that I was taught in geology by two significant Baptist Christians and one Methodist Christian. One of my professor, who was the youngest professor of geology that's ever been, he was 28 when he was appointed, was Frank Rhodes. And he wrote The Evolution of Life when I was in college, a very popular book on evolution. But he was a member of Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Swansea. And he was my professor during my years in Swansea from 65 to 68. And then my supervisor for my PhD was Dick Owen, and Dick Owen was a Methodist lay preacher. And so actually having people who were teaching you, who were themselves devout Christians, for whom the Christian faith was not contradicted in any way by the science, was an enormous help. And I also had, as my sedimentologist, was Gilbert Kelling. And Gilbert Kelling was a sedimentologist. He did work in the Orkneys, which led to support for plate tectonics. And he became professor at Keele University. And while he was there, he talked about thinking globally and acting locally. And he said that before anybody else ever said it. And Gilbert was the secretary of Newcastle under Lyme Baptist Church. So, here are three key geological figures. And then I was fortunate, as time went on, that when I came to Oxford, I met John Houghton. John Houghton was professor of astrophysics here in Oxford. He went on to be head of the Met Office, set up the Hadley Centre for the study of climate change. He was invited by Margaret Thatcher to be the UK representative on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He became chair of the scientific panel, which was the more mission-oriented panel. He's written the standard works on global warming, and he was knighted in 1991. He was awarded the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, for work on climate change, as a representative of the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change. And of course, he received that together with Al Gore, who of course is also a Baptist. Yeah. So
it's fascinating that actually, if we took the time and to tell the stories of how many people just in our congregations are engaged in science. Our science is at very high level, at international level, as you just shared. I'm also interested in how many actually you are not. There are many like you who also studied science and then became Baptist ministers. Yeah. Actually our whole story of Baptists and nonconformists in the free churches is science is everywhere, but it's not a story that we've often told.
So I wonder, John, if there's anything that comes to mind that's specific to kind of Baptist theology or Baptist church life that you think has got the potential to either help or hinder this engagement with science?
I think that the the major problem for a lot of Baptists, they always refer back to the Declaration of Principle, the first part of which they misinterpret. And they misinterpret it as the Bible is the sole source for governing, belief and practice. What they fail to understand is that what the principle says, it's Jesus Christ who is our source of belief and practice, as demonstrated, as revealed in the Scriptures. So I think that's the first point. So a lot of Baptists hold the Bible as being very important. I mean, I hold the Bible as being...
I would say all Baptists do, yeah.
Well, one would...
Hope so.
One would hope so. But it's the way in which the Bible is handled. The Bible is not somewhere where you just pick out a verse and it's. I used to tell the students over and over again, you have to see the context of the passage that you're looking at. The number of times that people quote a verse or they quote a short story out of the Bible and never ask what's before or after it. I find it intriguing that you can sort of take this is what the Bible is actually saying, and you say, well, actually, is it really saying that within the context? So to take the Bible seriously and to take it literally are two completely different things. In fact, I think to take the Bible literally is not to take it seriously. And not to understand who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it, to whom did they write it. All those questions are absolutely vital.
Yeah. So recognising that the Bible can both be a help and a hindrance, how do you think Baptists should be engaging with science today?
I would like Baptists to engage in science the way in which I have felt that it is engaged with me over the last 60 years. That actually I have seen things, I've heard things that I thought, well, I don't understand that. Why is that like that? And tried to actually discover what is being said. And rather than sort of turning around and saying, science must be wrong, there can't be multiverses, the universe can't be that big, it can't be that old. But rather to say, if it is 13.5 billion years old, and if it is at least 13.5 billion light years across, what does that say about God? How does my understanding of God come out of what is revealed by science? And I go back to when I was 5 years old, holding my father's hand and being shown sort of butterflies and grasses and leaves on trees, and sort of say, yeah, well, this is amazing. This is beautiful. When I look down the microscope, and look at the structure of one of my hairs under the microscope, well, what does that tell me about creation?
I think that's absolutely wonderful and possibly a good place to wrap up. But it's been really a privilege to hear a little bit about your own journey, John, and how you see science and religion fitting or complementing one another in Baptist life. So thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and do join us again for another episode of Baptists and Science.
These podcasts are brought to you by the Centre for Baptist Studies at Regent's Park College, University of Oxford. They were funded by a Science for Seminaries grant from the ECLAS, Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science project at Durham University.
The music is by Alan Kerry, and this episode was edited by Alan Kerry.